There we go. So welcome back to Latent Trait Measurement Model Central, otherwise known as 6249. We've got a little bit left to do in Lecture 1 as sort of big picture overview, sort of squishy stuff. Then we talk about classical test theory, alpha reliability, and that kind of stuff. So I put up some new things on the website. I have not yet downloaded your homework 0, but if you haven't done so, please try to complete that. I did fix the 2-point issue, though, so everything should be worth 2 points. And let me know if you're unable to access it or if you otherwise have questions. Let me see. I don't have the syllabus up, but I wanted to point out 2 schedule changes for next week. A week from Thursday, we will be only on Zoom because I am being kicked out of this classroom for comprehensive exams. So to those of you who are participating, good luck. Hope it goes well. The rest of us, you will get to see me from my basement, and I get to teach not in a mask that day, which is a fun treat. The other thing changed for next week is that because of the holiday on Monday and because I have an appointment on Wednesday that I can't reschedule, I'm moving office hours to Tuesday, Thursday after class, 3:30, just next week. This week I will be in my basement as usual. No one showed up yesterday either. So I'm there, and I have plenty of things to keep me busy if no one wants to talk to me, but just want to remind you that office hours are for you. So there are opportunities to task about not just stuff in this class, but research in general or anything else that you think I might be able to help with. So they are there for a reason. All right, so let's see. I'm recording. We got the Zoomers. We got the screen share. That's all good. I think I'm ready to do this. So I'm on slide 37 of Lecture 1. So far what we've been talking about is sort of big picture. What is this class about? I want to do a little bit on the idea of constructs and items now, and then this is something that I used to do more of at the front end, but I've decided to move towards the back end, because then we can have a more informed conversation about what to do when items don't quite work the way that you had intended, which is the norm, not the exception. So Kaylin, to your credit, not everything's going to fall apart. Sometimes it does, but hopefully it's like you're in the right area and you just got to tweak a little bit. But I know that you're working on a scale development thing, so I may call on you to give things. Is anyone else working on building a scale right now? Anyone? No? No one's like, please don't call on me. I'm not working on anything. Nope, nothing here to see.
Wouldn't you like to?
Exactly. Well, I will find out when I start reading your stuff, and then I will know that you're just being shy. But I've actually helped build quite a few scales, and so I have examples of what to do and what not to do from the real-life world of getting people to answer questions, which is often harder than you would think. But anywho, slide 37 here is where I'm starting. Zoomers, can you all hear me and see me? Hello, hello. Excellent. So this book, I used to own this book, and I lent it to somebody, and it never came back. So
Good of a book.
it was. I've actually really liked this book. And for those of you who are thinking of embarking on a scale development kind of activity, or just want to know more about measurement from like the starting point, the ground up, I recommend this book. It's written from sort of a psychology/ed perspective, but he has a lot of examples. This is Mark Wilson, the author. I don't believe that there's a second edition yet, so it's a little bit dated, but the advice is still pretty sound. So I'm borrowing his way of talking about things for this little unit of Chapter 1. So the idea of defining a construct and how do you build an instrument to measure a construct. So measurement is designed to quantify things that are inherently not quantifiable. So we have to figure out a way to do that makes sense, that is transferable, that is generalizable, but also is scientifically, what's the word I want? Supported, right? We all have some sort of theoretical perspective we're starting from, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is informed by that as much as possible. So the idea of, well, we're going to assign some numbers to some attributes. Like, well, what are all the decisions that you have to go through to get to that point? And just to remind you that all of these discussions start with the idea that you have a construct in mind that you're interested in measuring. That this construct is something that is inherently quantitative. It's something that varies continuously across the people you're trying to measure or the units you're trying to measure more generally. The only difference is what we call that construct. So we have our collection of terms that all start with latent, like latent variable, latent factor, latent construct. Then we have all of the discipline-specific names like true score, theta, factor score, and so forth. So each of these ideas of mapping a construct is talking about a unidimensional construct. Doesn't mean you can't do multidimensional measurement, but you have to start with one at a time, and you can do more than one eventually. Qualitative distinctions are okay, but inherently we're talking about the idea of measuring something that's continuous. And one of the articles on your reference list that I like in terms of thinking about what the endpoints would be make some interesting discussions about whether a construct is unipolar or bipolar. So if you think about something like happiness, right? We can all think of like items that like somebody who's super happy would endorse, but what is low happiness? Is it like meh, or is it sadness? And so how you think about where the endpoints of your continuum are going to inform the way that you ask questions to measure that. So is it the absence of something, or is it something in the opposite direction? Always something to think about. And just as a shout out to the other kinds of measurement models that are out there, if the way that you're thinking about your latent construct is that it is kinds of people, then the term for that is latent attribute, and you do not want to be in this world of models. Kinds of people, latent kinds, is the world of latent class, latent profile, mixture, what's the other term I'm thinking of? Models, the confirmatory version of which is what's known as either a diagnostic classification model, if you are within my household, or a cognitive diagnosis model if you're in someone else's. And so I have a link to a book, and there's other numerous resources around here, such as my better half, who will tell you all about those. Those models are designed to get at latent kinds of people, such as whether or not a student is proficient at a given skill, whether or not someone meets criteria to have this disorder or this syndrome. It's a yes or no actionable type of thing. If that's what you want as a classification, this is not the set of models for you. That is. So in this world, we're talking about the idea of measurement in terms of ordering of people and ordering of items. So we can think about types of people as varying in whatever would cause differences in this construct, but to be able to form an instrument to measure them, we have to think about ordering of items. So at a minimum, you would have an item that is binary, right? Either you do this or you don't. Now that is not a great idea if the thing that they're answering about is not truly binary. So for instance, like, is your child able to sit quietly? I don't know what I would answer if the only choices were yes or no. Sometimes he can. It depends would be my answer. Like, how much of the time can he sit quietly might be a different way to answer the question that's more informative. So binary is the least informative type of response that you can collect, but sometimes there are things that are truly binary, right? Like, have you ever been pregnant? That's the theme I've been talking about last week. Like, that's a binary thing, right? There are not many gradations on that. You know, have you had this happen to you or not? That's a binary thing. But a lot of the world is more graded than that, and so asking questions in a way that encourages information is usually a better strategy. So there's ways to introduce ordering in terms of the item content. So we can think about behaviors or other types of quantifiable things that are more or less extreme. But usually the way that we try to introduce this kind of variability is in the answering part. So to what extent, where a low item would be saying, I don't do this, a high item would be saying, I do this almost always, or something like that. So he has this idea of a construct map, which, again, sorry for how shitty this looks, but it's because this was a scan from like 2006, and as I said, I lost the book and couldn't find it. But I've got some better examples forthcoming. And his is sort of generic. He has respondents on the left-hand side, where there's like low at the bottom and middle and high, and then he has items on the right-hand side, where this item would respond with the lowest level, this one would be the highest level. And once upon a time in the classes at previous universities, I had folks make these for me. So I have a couple that I really liked that I'm borrowing. This one was from a student from speech and communication disorders, and she mapped out the speech sounds that people can pronounce by age. Now, I thought this was really interesting even before I became a parent, but this seems pretty spot on. So like my son, for instance, does not have any speech delays that I know of, but he cannot say TH to save his life. He's 7. So apparently I get to wait for that for another year. It's either an F sound, like 3 is free, or if it's in the middle of the word, like bother, it's bother. So it's either an F or a D for him, for instance. But this was respondents varying in ability as a function of age, and then some speech sounds are harder to say correctly than others. Also, in sort of the same vein, someone from the survey research program talked about skills in translating. And so you can think about people who are trained to do translation or standardized interviewing, where the top of it is someone who's certified, the bottom of it is someone who at least knows one language, and then these are all the various types of items that you can do at varying levels on this trait. So in your mind's eye, when you're thinking about developing a measure of something, and by the way, I will use the terms instrument, test, and scale interchangeably, just a collection of items to be given for the purposes of measurement. Ideally, you should be able to think about what would someone who's high on this look like? What would their characteristics be? What would someone who's low on this look like? And then on the item side, what kind of things would someone who's really good at this be able to do? And what kinds of things would a learner only be able to do, someone who's low on the trait or hasn't had a chance to practice? So that kind of thinking is supposed to be the basis of then how you would design a survey. So he goes over the 4 different components of an instrument design: the construct, that part, item generation, the outcome space, and then the measurement model. So there's a graphic in his book that I redrew because I liked it so much. The idea is that the construct that you have in mind and how you are thinking about what ordering means with respect to the item side then dictates what those items should be. So the items should be theoretically relevant and guided by whatever current research is saying, as well as what is missing from current research. The item then, what type of item it is, then drives what is a reasonable way to respond to that item. Like I said, some items truly are binary things, most of them aren't. Once you have a collection of responses, then what kind of response it is dictates what kind of measurement model you need. So it's not like CFA is for beginners and IRT is really advanced, which is something I've heard before. No, CFA is for continuous responses and IRT is for categorical responses. That's how it works. And yes, IRT is harder because it's for categorical responses, but so is any regression model predicting categorical responses, because it's the categorical part that makes it hard. And then the measurement model, hopefully then, if it fits properly, which is easier to figure out in CFA than IRT as well, if it fits properly, then that lends evidence towards people standing on a construct that you can go and do things with. So the key idea here is this bottom part. It's the measurement model is based on what kind of outcome you have. What kind of outcome you have is based on what kind of question is relevant, which should be based on your theory. So it all sort of feeds back into each other. Instruments are logical arguments, ... Yes, sir. Question or comment?
Yeah, can you explain again what we're trying to do with the 2 types of ordering of persons, ordering of item responses, and how that plays into all of this?
So like this idea, these ordering things?
Yeah, I mean, like, these 2 things, are they separate? How do we count, like, what are we doing with these in the...
At the end of the day, the scores on your construct are mapped to both of these sides at the same time.
Okay.
So like what does a 2 mean, for instance, right? The numbers are arbitrary because the space that we're working in is imaginary. Excuse me, latent. Latent means imaginary. We don't have it, right? So we have to give it a number. So once you decide on a system of numbering that everybody sort of agrees to, then what is a 2? Well, an item of a 2 has, this probability of success for someone of this level of ability. They define each other.
Okay, so in in order for an item to make sense, it should map onto both these scales. You can say something about them in both these, I guess, domains, right? That's what you're...
Yeah, so the idea is that if you want to measure the construct sort of on a wide variability of levels, the only way that's going to happen is if you have a wide variability in your items and what type of person in terms of their construct standing that item is designed for.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
So these are about items or the responses to items?
Ah, it is both, potentially, because what happens in non-educational contexts, sort of the psychology, sociology, the rest of the social sciences, is that the items tend to all kind of be about the same, except the response format then gives you this differentiation. So then, like, you know, never is down here and almost always is up here somewhere. And it becomes trickier to think about an item as having a place the more choices there are to how you respond to that item. But certainly for like binary items, then it really is like easy things are down here, mid-range things are here, and difficult things are here. And I would say that to the extent that you can a priori predict which items are more difficult or more severe, that is evidence for validity that you actually know what you're measuring. It is part of the evidence. One of the things that people say that drives me and a lot of other people nuts is the idea of validated. Like this scale's been validated, like it's done, it's over with. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Like you acquire evidence about the validity of this construct as a measure in this context, but you're not ever done. Because people and theories' understanding of a construct evolves over time. You know, the relevance of the items to the construct might change over time. So for instance, there is a measure of, I want to say it's like socioeconomic status or social class or something on a famous survey. I'm trying to remember which one it is, but I don't. That's probably just as well since I'm about to criticize them. And one of the items is that if you are of high class, you always carry a pocket square. Like, what the hell is that? That's like a handkerchief, right? Like, that's like a Kleenex that you don't throw away. You wash it, and then you use it again. And, like, my dad has a handkerchief in his pocket still, but I would argue that none of you do. Anyone got a pocket square?
Yeah, I've never seen it on anyone.
Exactly.
Mostly farmers would be the ones you'd find having them now, which is going to usually classify them.
Believe it or not, I actually have a stash of handkerchiefs because what I do is I wrap them around the water bottle that I'm carrying while I run. And so then it becomes a sweat rag in addition to an insulator. I wouldn't say that makes me high class, though. I'd say that makes me pragmatic. Just like I wouldn't say that we're all low class because none of us has a pocket square on us currently. You know, there's in word templates for like what is a dominant meaning versus a subordinate or secondary meaning in English. Like this, mouse. Like if I said the word mouse, how many of you would think of this? And how many of you would think of the animal? Like once upon a time, the animal would have been the dominant meaning, but arguably this is what people think of when it comes to mouse for now. So point being, validity is a piece of evidence. One way to acquire such evidence is to be able to predict the ordering of severity or difficulty of your items. There, that was a very long answer to a short question. Did I answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
So again, just to summarize, what we're trying to do with the items is we're taking a graded latent variable, and we're trying to, for each level, we're trying to make an item.
Yeah, ideally, yes. Assuming you want to measure the whole thing.
Yep.
So if your goal is to target people who need extra support or remediation, you might want a whole bunch of low items and maybe not a lot of high items, because if they're above some threshold, you don't care how high they are. If you're trying to target folks who show very high ability for further, you know, exposure, development, training, whatever, then the opposite would be true. So thinking about this ahead of time, it's like, what is this measure for? Who is it for? What kind of person? And then building the items with that sort of perspective in mind. All right, we did that, we did that, we did that. Okay, so can the instrument be used in the way that you want it to be used? This isn't something that can be gained from one study in most cases. So even though you might feel really good about your new measure and it works the way you're supposed to, got to give it a whole bunch more times to figure out really how it behaves in practice. Beyond just what the construct is that it's trying to measure, there's the descriptive component. And so one of the things in the book that he talks about is all these other things that you have to think about. What type of language do you want to use? Not just like literally, Spanish, English, German, what have you, but how easy do the items need to be for the people who are answering the questions to answer correctly? What context? What's the method of administration? So this is where doing your homework before you begin is imperative. So this, to me, is kind of like mixed methods. Now, as someone who knows zero about qualitative methods, you may say, yeah, Lisa, that's not it. But the way that I think of it is it's a combination of information gathering, but also, talking to the people that you would be trying to measure, asking targeted questions, having focus groups and those sorts of things. What are the things that go into this? What are the things I should be asking? Once you have items, do they make sense? Are they relevant? Have you covered every possible answer choice that someone might give? All of that kind of stuff can't be overstated as to how important that is. So we have all the pieces of that going into this here. On the response format side, you have to decide how fixed you want to be. Yes. This is iterative, and it's often not obvious until after the fact when you have data that your item doesn't work very well. In general, though, you want items that are written as clearly and easily as possible with not referring to multiple things. Ideally, you would not confound the way a question is worded with what it's about. So there are several scales that I'm familiar with where one of the subscales is entirely negatively worded items and another subscale is entirely positively worded. Then any relationship between those constructs is in part what the items are about and in part the way you ask the question. That's not ideal. There's a term that goes into scales that ask the same question in a whole bunch of different ways. That term is bloated specific. You can have a scale that looks like it has really high reliability because you've asked the same question 10 different times, essentially. That's also not good. In the book, he talks about sort of the trade-offs between open-ended responses. So we'll see this in a lot of contexts, like if you're watching a dialogue between, say, a mother and her child, or a father and his child about how the parent is responding. People might code the video for various things. You have the videos and you can decide on your coding scheme later versus something like the person is answering a fixed format where you have here's your 5 choices and this is what you have to say. That's a lot more work on the front end, but it's less work on the back end to figure out what to do with the data. So here's a couple examples of what I think are actually really good response formats. So this is from one of my former students as well. They have something, this scale is measuring, I'm trying to remember exactly what the word was, but basically one's competence in describing their religious beliefs was sort of a very narrow focus, but they had a reason that they wanted to measure that, so whatever. Do you feel confident in explaining your beliefs? And then confident is part of all the answers. How often? And then there's a lot of choices here. And these choices are based on what often would mean in the context of this kind of item. And how good are you? And then different ways of saying not good, little bit good, very good. Now, one thing that may strike you right off the bat, is it okay to have all these different choices in the same scale?
You have enough power.
What if I was just going to add these items up? This is 1. This is 1. This is 1. You cool with that? Yeah. If your goal is to create a sum score, this would be a terrible idea. If your goal is to estimate a measurement model by which to indicate latent traits, this is a great idea. So one of the things that you are free from in this new space of latent space is that you don't have to make all your items the same. If some of the things you're asking about are truly binary, let them be binary. If some of the things are better described with this sort of, 7-point continuum of frequency, do it that way. You do not have to have the same answer choices or the same number of answer choices. You don't. This is the idea that everything has to be the same is derived from the idea of adding things up. And if you're not going to do that, you're not stuck in that world. So I actually like this quite a bit because I feel like someone who's answering these questions would understand what each of these questions is about and be able to pick an answer that best describes how they feel. Versus something like this. Oh God, yeah, exactly. Sometimes I feel caught between wanting to buy things to make me look better in some ways to others when I really should be spending more money in ways that have more spiritual meaning. What? Can I get a what for 1,000, Alex? So even after you finish parsing this question, which by the way, it would take a very high reading level in that language to be able to parse it.
There's like a lot of cultural cues in there too.
Yeah, there's I kind of feel like the person who's asking me this wants a certain answer, and I'm the problem if I don't give it to them. That is not good. So beyond just the complexity, sort of the response demand or social desirability confluence. The other thing I've seen that I don't like, for instance, is this. 1 is never and 5 is always. What's 2? What's 3? If you don't know what 3 is, how are they supposed to know? If you really don't want to do numbers, make a slider bar. Make it truly continuous so they don't have to think about what numbers or words mean. But I think if you're going to have discrete choices, you should be able to come up with the words. And if you can't come up with words that are sufficiently distinct, then that will probably show in your data. The difference between sometimes and often, how much is that? Exactly. Or there's other words that people is strongly lower than extremely? How about critically? Is that higher than both of those? Maybe? I don't know. So it is the case that in general, the more information you can get out of somebody, the better, meaning the more choices, but only to the point where the choices are truly differentiable. If they can't tell the difference between what a 3 and a 4 is, then that may show up as those two things basically being collapsed across each other in terms of their item parameters. So I tend not to like this. I would not recommend this. Another thing that you may not find until after your study is that you need to change the labels. So something like this, strongly disagree, disagree, this is fine for a lot of stuff. But if you're dealing with a construct where everybody would agree to some extent, then 3 of these are never going to be used, and you really have a 4-point scale. So there was one study that I was involved in that had this problem, where one of the items was measuring family quality of life, and one of the questions was it's important to me that my family is healthy. Who's going to say no to that? Sorry, Huey, you're on your own. I don't give a shit. No one's going to say no to that. So that's not a great item just from that perspective, but if I wanted to truly tease apart levels of importance, it would have to start at important as the lowest one. And then very strongly, extremely, critically, I don't know what order those go in, but more. So you need to stretch out the high ends to get variability if you ask a question like that. Another thing to think about in these is that what if this doesn't apply to you? What if you ask a question and there is no answer because there can't be? So I get feedback surveys from the hospital every time I go there for some kind of appointment. And they ask me were you happy how any problems were resolved? Well, I didn't have a problem. So do I answer that with my latent space? If there were a problem, how happy would I have been had it been resolved? I don't know how to answer that. So actually on my feedback survey, I wrote in the open-ended comments, please give me a not applicable answer, because that is truly not applicable. I don't think it's going to work, but I thought I'd try. Didn't sign my name, though, because I don't want to do free consulting for the hospital and survey design. But point being, you got to give them an answer, because you don't want people making things up or skipping it. Informative missing data, if they can't answer the question, is not good. Now, what to do with those answers? Up to this point, most people would say just call it missing data, because not applicable doesn't belong on this continuum. But what if it does? There is a model that came out fairly recently that we may or may not have time for, but I have it on the syllabus, which is a semi-ordered nominal model where you can actually split the item out into whether like they answered not applicable or not, and then the ordering to see if the extent to which they answered the question is informative. Because it may be. There may be certain items that people who are high on a trait don't want to answer the item because they're high on the trait. Or somebody who didn't have a problem at the hospital is probably more satisfied than somebody who did have a problem, even if that problem was resolved successfully. Not having a problem is informative. So in thinking about what the answer choices are, you got to cover all the bases, or people will just make things up or leave it blank, and that's bad.
Can I?
Please.
I just want to plug
Plug.
survey methods with Katie Broughton in Education Policy and Leadership Studies. It's a solid class and talks a lot about these. So you were talking best practices, Lisa.
Good. I'm glad. When is that class offered? Is
In the spring.
every spring?
It's up every other spring, and this spring should be when it's offered.
Okay, we got another thumbs up from the Zoomers on that class. Katie Broughton, EPLS survey, what is it called?
Survey research method. Let me look up, I'll get the course number.
Okay, survey research methods. I've heard of the class, but I don't remember what the numbers are. Yes, I think any class like that for someone who's going to be dealing with squishy constructs like this is important. Yep. There are people whose entire science is based on figuring out what the impact of these choices is in how people answer and how to best design surveys to minimize extraneous variance. Yes, indeed. Thank you for the plug. All right. Any other stories? Anyone else want to talk, throw some shade at surveys they've read about? Please.
The hospital, you made me think of whenever I go in and they ask like for certain like symptoms or something, and they say like in the past 2 weeks has this occurred how many times, and they use the word several, which really bothers me because several to me means 6 or 7, and to most people I guess it means a few, like 3 or 4. So I think that like using words like that, like giving actual numbers is much more helpful than using a word like several or few.
Yes, agree that several is ambiguous. I think a few is 3 because a couple is 2.
Right.
Like,
I've
and
had
that's in
this argument
English,
with
right?
people so many times who are like, no, a several is 3 or 4. I'm like, no, it's not.
When I was in grade school, I had a teacher that would like do this little sing song where it was like A is 1, couple is 2, 2 is 3 or 4, several is 5 or more. So I have that like in my head whenever I'm thinking. But yeah, most people don't. So I always answer different.
Yeah, it would be much better if they gave an actual number. Because for some of the behaviors, like, it couldn't happen like 7 times a day, depending on what they're asking about, but others could. So, like, per, units matter. Did you have a question, Farhan?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to make a comment.
Yeah.
The thing that bothers me about all of this is, well, for one, the word might mean different things to different people. And then for the same person, it might mean very different at different times of the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess I'm talking about reliability, aren't I?
Potentially.
I'm a bit rusty on the basic stuff.
Yeah, to the extent that people answer for reasons other than what you want to measure, that's going to decrease your reliability and potentially your validity. The way that I think about it is like reliability is a problem if you're introducing sort of random error, but systematic error is what threatens validity. Like there is a signal, it's just not the one you wanted to capture. That would be a problem. But yeah, that brings up a whole nother issue of how surveys get translated into other languages and whether that translation actually works as intended as an empirical question. I had a student who was working with, I think it was Tim's data. Thank you, Nikki, for the shout out to the Zoomers. It's EPOLS 6209 for those of you keeping track. And this student was fluent in Arabic and English, and he realized that 2 of the items that were loading backwards, like they were negatively related, was because the translation literally flipped the meaning of the word without intent. And only he would have known this, right? Because he has this unique skill set that has 2 different languages plus measurement models, which is a very valuable combination. So I know we have a lot of folks here who are multilingual. That can be one of the things that helps you make your mark in this world. So, anywho.
Related to that, my husband was running into a problem with translation for feminism into Arabic because in Qatar the word for it is just woman. So
okay.
like,
That's-
so you're trying to ask people about feminism, and you're using the word woman, it's going to lead to very different answers.
It could. It very well could. And the extent to which that is the case could also be an empirical question. So that's one thing I found people don't tend to think about. All of the principles that you learned about experimental design, absolutely you could apply to a survey. If you think that woman should be best represented by this word or that word, randomly assign people to both versions of the survey and see what happens. If you are unsure whether people answer differently, if you give them paper and pencil versus Qualtrics, do both and see what happens. So all of the things that, in terms of systematically varying something in random assignment, you can absolutely leverage those same techniques to answer these sorts of questions as to what the best way of doing this might be.
And then you get 2 studies for the price of 1.
You do.
Because survey research needs this kind of stuff.
Yep, because then your findings about what worked best goes in one place, and then you use what worked best to go do the thing that you meant to do. Absolutely, yes. I was going to say something else, but I forgot. Probably just as well. Class isn't over yet, right? Okay, good. I haven't rambled too far then. All right, so yes, as we said before, the type of model you need is dictated on what kind of response format. So if you have binary items, pretty much everyone will yell at you if you try to pretend like they're normal and continuous. Fair. If you have 3 categories, still some yelling. 4 to 5, then we start getting into the SEM meets IRT literature where people have done simulations to see what is continuous enough. By the way, what I would call ordinal is called polytomous in this context. So those, polytomous means categorical rather than quantitative. There are particular IRT options for ordinal responses or semi-ordered responses. Depending on the distribution of the item responses, CFA might not be too bad. Generally speaking, for a ordinal item to be sufficiently continuous, it would need to have a mean near the middle and be symmetric. So just because you have 5 categories doesn't mean that it's going to be continuous. It depends on how people use them. There are measurement models for ipsative data, but I would avoid them if you can. So things where you say, like, take this list and order them from highest to lowest. Then you don't have as much information because the last person's choice is dictated by what their other choices were. And the other thing is that it doesn't allow people to fully express how much they like something more than something else. So like if you ask me, rank your favorite ice cream flavors from highest to lowest, and you give me like vanilla, strawberry, chocolate, or mint chip, right? I have to put mint chip last, but what I really want to do is move it to an entirely different planet because it's an abomination. It's not just last. I would have to be dying of starvation before I will eat mint and chocolate together. It's gross. One is toothpaste and one is dessert, and they don't go together. And I feel very strongly about this, as you can tell. But if you just make me rank it last, I can't tell you just how much I hate it. So ipsative limits your potential for showing variability. It also makes your analyses more complicated, and I would avoid it unless you're absolutely forced to do it for some other reason.
It kind of comes in handy when you want chocolate, but you also want the minty feel of having brushed your teeth, but you don't want to brush your teeth. So.
Honestly,
What?
so that's when you want dessert, but you want to feel, what's the word I want? Like good about yourself that you brushed your teeth. No, those York peppermint patties, like they seriously make me want to hurl when I smell them. Like that combination, I can't. The rest of it I can work with, but very few things I feel that strongly about from the food domain. Anywho, as a example, I don't actually hate everything. I realize that like the last 3 classes I've been all like, but I don't hate everything. It just happens to be on the topics. But. Anywho, summarizing. A lot of stuff we have to do this semester. A lot of words that mean the same thing that acquire different terms based on who we're reading and what we're in, and I will try to help us guide through all of that stuff. My goal by the end of the semester is that you're able to build a measurement model and evaluate its dimensionality, its reliability, and its fit, regardless of what kind of response format you're using. Hopefully the response format is dictated by the relevant concerns in terms of your measurement of your construct and everything else. How's that? Yes, question?
I have a question. Could you just give me few examples of how not or how to read that, like the second option, the last PowerPoint,
This,
and the last option.
the last one.
Yeah, the second one. I don't know how to read that.
Polydamas?
Yeah, can you give me some example of those items?
So the term polydamas refers to either ordinal or nominal in terms of scales of measurement. Basically anything that's not binary. So the field of CFA was developed from the perspective of sort of regression, multivariate normal as the guiding thing. And so we pretend like the item responses are just regular, plausibly normal, continuous things. And it's actually marginally normal, not conditionally, because all of the traits are supposed to be normal, which means the whole thing together is supposed to be normal. It's not so much the normal as it is the linear relationship between the trait and the item that's the problem. Because if you have an item, say, that has 4 category responses, and you're willing to pretend like those 4 are actually numbers, the model has to understand that it can't predict a score higher than 4, regardless of how high your trait is, and it can't predict a score lower than 1, regardless of how low your trait is. So the normal approximation, as I have it here, what's known as confirmatory factor analysis, can predict outcomes that go out of bounds because it's a slope that keeps on going forever and ever. So the question is, where does it go out of bounds? Does it go out of bounds after most people are done, like out of range of where the trait would be, or does it go out of bounds before then? And if it goes out of bounds before then this is probably not a good idea. So then in terms of the mapping, and we'll talk more about this, but just very briefly since you asked, graded response models in IRT are for ordinal response formats. It is the same thing as what we call a proportional odds or an ordinal regression model, if it were just using observed predictors. The partial credit model is an adjacent category link for ordinal responses. So you're modeling the transition between categories separately for each pair without the assumption that the whole thing is ordered the way that a graded response model does. Is that where you were going, or am I off track? Yeah? Okay, and then nominal is the other one. That's for answers like, what's your favorite kind of ice cream? Where we could argue about the order, but there really isn't one. And nominal is just called nominal. It's either known as multinomial in a regression context, baseline category logit. Generalized logit is another one I've heard, but that's a terrible name because generalized means like 6 other things. It does. Like that's not a helpful word.
I expect nothing less.
Yeah, people who name stuff in here, like, yeah, there's a lot of things that are unnecessarily confusing because people use the same names, but hey, that's why we all are going to get paid someday, because we're going to learn this stuff and then someone else will pay us to not have to learn it.
I got lured into a conference presentation because they used the word hierarchical, and it turns out they were using the boring hierarchical.
Oh. Well, it spends the same on your CV, though, don't it? Absolutely. All right. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. Any other comments or questions before we shift gears a little bit? Yes, sir.
So, if it's nominal, what is I'll say theta because IRT, what is theta measuring then?
So in a nominal item, basically how each category compares to a reference category is modeled with a separate submodel in its own slope. So like you would say that, there's an increase, let me see here, let me phrase it the other way. The probability that you will pick B instead of A increases as theta increases. But the probability that you pick C instead of A decreases as theta increases. So everything is relative to either one common response option as a reference baseline, which I think is the easier way to think about it, or everything is relative to everything summing to 0, which is a harder way to think about it, but that's the way that it's phrased in some software. There is an article on your reading list in the IRT section. Revuelta, I think, is the lead author. I like that article quite a bit. It was the first time I felt like I ever understood the other version of nominal. And they have M+ code, which always makes me happy when I can actually make it work. The second half of the article was above my pay grade. I will just say that. I'm being real. I can't read